You have prayed for most of your life, maybe 30 years, maybe 50. You have read the book cover to cover. You have sat in the pew. You have done, as far as you can tell, everything that was ever asked of you. And in all that time, you have never once heard God speak to you. Not a voice, not a sign, not the warmth other people seem to describe so easily. And then one night, you find yourself watching a testimony online. A stranger who wasn't even a believer pulled back from the edge of death and met, they say, by a light that was love itself. And a thought rises in you that you would never say out loud, not in church, not to your family, maybe not even to yourself in plain words. Why them? Why everyone but me? This video is about that question, and about the thing almost no one standing in a pulpit is willing to say about it. Here's what makes this particular pain so isolating. It feels like a confession of failure. In most faith communities, there is an unspoken assumption that closeness to God is something you can measure. By how strongly you feel His presence, by the answered prayers, so by the sense of being personally led. So when you feel none of that, year after year, the natural conclusion is that something must be wrong with you. Your faith is too weak. There's sins you haven't confessed. You're not trying hard enough. And so you stay quiet about it. Because saying it out loud, I have been faithful my whole life, and I have never felt God at all, sounds in the wrong room like doubt, or ingratitude, or worse. One viewer wrote it plainly under a near-death testimony. It amazes me, he said, that God will speak to people who aren't even saved. And I've been a Christian for 50 years and never heard God speak to me. 50 years. That comment didn't sit there alone. Below it, dozens of others quietly agreed. People who had been carrying the same question, in the same silence, for almost as long. Because here is the truth that rarely gets said from the front of a room. This experience, the experience of God's silence, is not rare. It is not a sign of weak faith. And some of the most devout people who have ever lived have known it more intimately than anyone in that congregation ever guessed. There is a name for it, and it isn't hidden away in some obscure tradition. It's in the book you already trust. In the Psalms, the prayer book of the faithful for 3,000 years, and you find it everywhere. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? That's Psalm 13. Not the prayer of someone who had wandered away from God. The prayer of a man Scripture itself calls a man after God's own heart. There is a psalm, the 88th, that many scholars call the darkest in the Bible, because unlike almost every other lament, it never turns. It never reaches the line where the writer says, "But I will trust anyway." It simply ends in the dark. The writer says, in effect, that darkness has become his closest friend. And God let that prayer stand in Scripture, uncorrected, for everyone in every century to read. And then there is the cross. At the very center of the faith, in its single most important moment, the Son of God cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was not performing for the crowd. In that moment, he felt the silence too. Sit with what that means. The experience you have been carrying as proof that something is wrong with your faith is the same experience at the very heart of the gospel itself. And it did not stop with the Bible. Charles Spurgeon, the most famous preacher of his century, a man who filled one of the largest churches in London week after week, spent much of his life fighting a darkness so heavy he called it a fainting of the soul. He preached the presence of God to thousands while privately struggling to feel it himself. William Cowper, who wrote some of the most beloved hymns in the English language, lived for years convinced that God had abandoned him completely. These were not weak men. They were not men of small faith. They were men who learned what you may be learning right now. that the felt presence of God and the reality of faith are two different things, and that the people who have walked closest to the second have often gone the longest without the first. So why does almost no one say this from the pulpit? Part of it is honest difficulty. It is hard to stand in front of a congregation that came for encouragement and tell them that faithfulness might be answered with silence. But part of it is simpler. The standard answers are easier, and the standard answers, however well-meant, often deepen the very wound they're trying to close. Pray more. As if the person hasn't been praying for 30 years. There must be sin in your life. As if the only possible cause is guilt. You're just not listening. As if the failure is one of attention, and the cure is to try harder at the exact thing that has already exhausted them. For a person in the middle of this experience, each of these lands the same way, as confirmation that they're doing it wrong, that everyone else has been handed something they've been locked out of, that the problem is them. And so the loneliness compounds, not just the silence of God, but the silence they have to keep about the silence. The quiet performance of a faith that feels, from the inside, like standing in a room full of people who are all hearing music you can't hear. That is the cost almost no one names. Not the silence itself. The shame of having to hide it. I want to be careful here. I am not going to tell you what God is doing in your life. I don't know. No honest person does. But I can offer you what the tradition offers. Not as a doctrine you have to accept, but as a frame worth holding. There is a difference between an experience and a relationship. The people in those near-death testimonies were given an experience. Vivid, overwhelming, undeniable, and for many of them it arrived at the one moment they had run out of every other resource, at the very edge of death itself. What you have been doing is different and, arguably, harder. You have kept faith with no experience to lean on, no light, no voice, no warmth to confirm you're even on the right road. Just the decision, made again every single morning, to keep believing in something that has never once made itself felt. In almost every contemplative tradition, that is not the lesser path. It is considered the deeper one. Older Christians who wrote about the life of prayer had a word for the dramatic spiritual feelings, the warmth, the sense of presence. They called them consolations. And they warned, again and again, against mistaking the consolations for God Himself. Feelings arrive and they leave. Faith that survives their absence is the rarer thing. So if you have spent decades in silence and you still pray, it may not mean you were past, over. It may mean you were trusted with the harder version of the same faith. I don't know if that reframe lands for you. It may not. The pain of feeling unheard by God is real, and no video closes that wound in 12 minutes. But if you have carried this, quietly, for years, certain that the silence was evidence against you, I want to leave you with one thing. You are not the exception you believe you are. The 50-year believer who wrote that comment is not alone. The saints who felt abandoned were not alone. And whatever the silence means, it has been the companion of some of the most faithful people who have ever lived. So here is my question for you. Not about theology. Not about what you believe happens after death. Just this. If God has been silent, and you are still here, still praying, still asking, what do you think that says about your faith? I'd like to hear your honest answer, not the answer you'd give in church, the real one. Leave it in the comments. I read everyone. One more thing before you go. This is a small channel, still growing, and it exists for a specific reason. For the experiences that don't come with neat answers, the stories most places either explain away or dress up or rush past. Here we just sit with them, honestly, without pretending to know more than we do. If that's the kind of space you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Not for the algorithm, for the company. So the next time one of these stories finds you, you won't be sitting with it alone. There aren't many of us here yet. But that's exactly the point.